think about. Okay, if it's okay, I'm going to move on to the last section. Because Bitter End says we need to be there by, did you say by 10?
Yeah, we have to actually order by 10.
Order by 10, okay. All right. We should be more than fine on time, but I just want to play it safe here. And this, I saved the hardest one for last, which is the national debt. And as you can see, this is already out of date. It's now $22 trillion. So the conventional wisdom is if we don't balance the budget quickly or pay down the debt, we're going to need faster and faster inflation to fund government expenditures, and that's going to lead to a Weimar Republic-style hyperinflation. The reason this is hard for me is on the national debt, going forward 10, 20, 30 years, unlike QE, there are so many variables involved that I'm still fairly confident saying I don't think there's going to be a hyperinflation, but I am going to hold out the possibility that in 20 or 30 years we might see higher inflation, but I don't think hyperinflation, and I'll explain why. My counter to the conventional wisdom is I wish it was true that we have to pay down the debt and balance the budget. I'm sure most people in this room, like me, think it's somewhat morally reprehensible that our federal government borrows so much and is going to put it on the backs of future generations and also pay for it with inflation, effectively so that you can deficit spend. I don't know if some of you feel this way. I personally think it's deficit spending to get more votes, all right, without the level of taxation required to pay for it. So I wish that was really true, but sadly the math, this is just plain old mathematics, says otherwise. And unfortunately the policymakers are well aware of the mathematics, but a lot of the public is not aware of the mathematics. So let's review the national debt. So here I've got this on usgovernmentspending.com. The national debt is over 21, it's now $22 trillion, and here it is going all the way back to the 1970s, so you can see it's increasing exponentially. The important thing is not the green, the red, and the blue. That is kind of interesting, how much is held by the public, how much is held by intergovernmental agencies, and how much of it is held by the Federal Reserve. But in all, it's $22 trillion, okay? Who holds them? It's the same thing as I pointed out earlier in the previous chart. This, by the way, I think I included this because you often hear China holds all our debt, China holds all our debt. Actually, Chinese debt holdings, U.S. Sovereign debt holdings, is about $1 trillion. It's a lot. But in the whole scheme of things, China doesn't have quite as much leverage over us as people like to think with their treasury holdings. But as you can see, U.S. individual institutional investors are the biggest holders. Then the intergovernmental agencies like Social Security, government pension funds are the next largest holder of treasuries. Foreign investors are a little bit larger, but that's spread across several countries. And that includes foreign institutions, so that could be like UBS, for example. Then intergovernmental agencies, and finally the Fed holds $2.38 trillion, and that's going down, as we've talked about. They're unwinding their balance sheet, they're reducing their balance sheet. Okay, what's more important, you've probably heard, is not so much the actual number, which is pretty scary, but what is it compared to GDP? So the debt to GDP ratio is much more important to economists than the dollar amount in nominal terms of the debt itself. So again, just looking at the top here, not the individual colors, but go all the way to the top. Okay, so our current debt to GDP ratio is about 106%, which is a peacetime record. But it's actually not the record. The record is right after World War II. The federal government had to borrow so much in order to pay for the war, where it hit 120%. And the history here is kind of interesting. You can see it fell down into the 70s. And then starting in the 80s with the Reagan deficits, it grew not nearly as dramatically as we hear it grew, but it did grow. Went down in the end of the Clinton administration. During the George W. Bush era, it actually grew very, very little. A lot of people don't know that. We hear about how Bush, almost doubled the debt or whatever, but as a percent of GDP, it was a very small increase right up until the financial crisis. And then, like the last fiscal year of Bush's presidency, it went up quite a bit, and then the rest of this is Obama. But I'd want everyone here to think more in terms of debt as a percent of GDP than the actual number itself. Okay, so why is $21 trillion not as alarming as it sounds? And I can't believe I'm saying this because I hate the national debt. Okay, but it's true. Maybe pretend I'm like a Keynesian or a socialist or a very left-leaning economist talking, okay, because this is truly how they think. And in some ways, I think they are mathematically correct. I'm going to sound like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, better to be morally correct than factually or correct or whatever, right? Okay. All right, so the sleight of hand, the way that policymakers have continuously and will continue to try to get out of growing debt being a problem is with growth and inflation. I think most people know about the inflation. Most people who are aware or read the business pages know that the government creates inflation so that the dollar will lose value down the road, and when they pay debt back, they're paying back in real terms with pennies on the dollar. So for example, if you achieve 2.5% inflation every year, within 30 years, the dollar is worth like 50 cents or somewhere close to 50 cents. So you basically devalue your way out. What people tend not to think of as much, but it's just as important, is simply economic growth. If the economy produces more goods and services 30 years from now, if the economy produces twice as many goods and services 30 years from now, you can create, the debt in real terms will be half what it was at the beginning, because the government is collecting twice as much in taxes. Does that make sense? Anyone want me to repeat that? Okay, so growth is one way to make the debt number look less significant down the road, because the economy is larger, it's larger in real terms, it's larger in nominal terms, and the government's still assuming collecting the same percent in taxes of the overall economy. Now the price tag on paying back the debt has just been cut in half. So I did the math here. If the economy in real terms grows 2.5% per year, we're actually growing faster than that now, right? The last couple of years. Whether you like or don't like Trump, I mean, it is true. The growth really did kind of pick up with his presidency. If you compound 2.5% growth over 30 years, the economy will be 109% larger. So even if there's no inflation at that rate, our GDP 30 years from now, instead of being $21 trillion, will be $44 trillion. Now, if you add to that inflation, so that is if you grow 2.5% a year, and then the Fed deliberately produces 5% more money, not 2.5%, but 5% more money. So the first 2.5 is to keep prices stable, even though the economy is growing, and the other 2.5 is to increase prices by an additional 2.5%. That gives you a 109% increase in prices over 30 years. And now what was your $43.89 trillion real GDP in nominal terms becomes $92 trillion. That sounds incredible, doesn't it? I'm 49. Unless we have some Great Depression, there's a very good chance in my lifetime that I will see a $100 trillion U.S. GDP. Part of that due to the fact the economy is larger, but part of that also due to the fact that just prices keep relentlessly going up. Okay. Looks like you have a question.
Yeah, I'm confused.
Okay. Well, you can hold it for Q&A.
Yeah.
All right. So, assuming the government doesn't borrow another dollar, and I know that's pretty ridiculous, okay, but if they went cold turkey and said, well, how are we going to pay back the $21 trillion we already owe? In 30 years, instead of being 106% of GDP, it's only going to be 22.9% of GDP. And I don't think, if I went back to my chart, I don't think it's been that low going all the way back to the Great Depression. Yeah, it's never been that low. Okay, so 22.9% of GDP is eminently manageable. I think even some of the best positioned developed countries in the world, like Singapore, are at 30%. Okay. Now, we all know the government's not going to stop borrowing. I can tell you that these anticipation of future growth and inflation is already baked into their fiscal policy. They are betting on this continuing indefinitely year after year after year, and that is why they borrow as much as they do, because they're thinking we'll be able to get out of it, okay. I don't approve of this kind of thinking. I think you should just balance the budget and pay down the debt and not rely on future growth and future inflation, but what can I say, it's the government, right? Okay. What if you bump that up? Instead of 2.5, you just go up 0.5% to 3% growth and 3% inflation. Well, instead of, what do I have here, $91 trillion GDP, in 30 years it becomes $124 trillion. That's the magic of logarithmic exponential growth, right, or compound interest. So I don't know if you've seen Steve Mnuchin, Trump's Treasury Secretary. He's been saying, oh, if we can achieve 3% growth, it'll get us out of a lot of our problems. You know, he knows that extra half point or an extra point of GDP growth makes a really big difference in the long term. And he's not the only one. I mean, every Treasury Secretary prior to him, going all the way back to Andrew Mellon, probably has thought in these same terms. So now the $21 trillion debt is only 17% of GDP. Now, if you think this is just a theory, it's not. It's been going on in our entire lifetimes. You guys, some of you are too young to remember this. I'm old enough to remember. Remember 1988, the debt hit $2 trillion? Everybody freaked out, right? These are some quotes. I heard these quotes. $2 trillion is insane, and we'll never be able to pay it back. And we're bankrupt, right? Well, actually, we were. That part is true. We were bankrupt, and we are still bankrupt, but it depends on your definition of bankrupt. Well, yeah. I mean, not only were we bankrupt, Adam Smith knew, 200 years prior that we were bankrupt, because if you go to the Wealth of Nations, I don't think he was the first, but he's the most famous of the first. He wrote, when national debts have been accumulated to a certain degree, there is scarce a single instance of their having been fairly and completely paid. The raising of the denomination of the coin, that's i.e. inflation, has been the most usual expedient by which a real public bankruptcy has been disguised under the appearance of a pretended payment. So the moment the United States, as a matter of policy, began resorting to inflation as a tool to ameliorate, I think is the word, okay, thank you, the size and the effects of the national debt, in my opinion, I think Adam Smith would agree, it was effectively declaring bankruptcy. Okay, so this is why I would say, yes, we are bankrupt. All right. Oh, yeah, there he is. Okay, Adam Smith. I don't know why I had to hit a key to see him, but all right. And again, 1988. When we had a $2 trillion debt, it was nothing. It was like right here. So if I could go back and check, but the debt to GDP had probably gone up to about 50%. And again, it was 120% during World War II. How do you think the government paid back the 120% of GDP debt after World War II, now that you've seen, the sleight of hand, all right? You'll hear a lot of people say, oh, tax rates were 90%, AOC is saying that, now Bernie Sanders would say, tax rates were 90%, those were the glory days, we need to go back to 90% taxes. And you'll occasionally hear a conservative say, well, yeah, but at least they were using the money back then to pay down the debt from World War II. That's why the tax rates were so high. That's actually not true. I went back and found how many years is this? The 35 years after World War II, and found as a percent of GDP, every fiscal year's surplus or deficit. And of the 35 years after World War II, 27 of those years the federal government ran a deficit. It continued to borrow. And in only 8 of those years did it run a surplus. So the federal government was not paying back debt after World War II. Okay, it was continuing to borrow more and more. In fact, in nominal terms, the debt must have continued to go up, except in those surplus years it might have gone down a little, but in terms of nominal dollars, it kept climbing. It got out of it with growth and inflation. GDP and inflation made that, in fact, I wish I had the number. I could probably go back and find it. I think the debt from World War II might have been $200 billion, which was all the money in the world in 1945. But by the time we got to 1980, and GDP was, I don't know, I'd have to look it up. GDP might have been $3 trillion or $4 trillion. $200 billion was nothing. So Paul Krugman's even said it, and I tried to find the exact quote. I couldn't find it, but he has repeatedly said, yeah, we paid down the World War II debt with growth and a little inflation, quote unquote, a little inflation. Okay. I'm sorry, this is a really busy slide, but it does make a good point. This has been going on for a while. Alvin Hansen, I don't quite understand his math. I went and tried to do it myself. It didn't make any sense. But Alvin Hansen, who was the American Keynes, so when Keynesianism came into vogue in the 1930s and the 1940s, the ambassador of Keynesian theory in the United States was this Harvard professor named Hansen, and he wrote a bunch of books for the general public. But he figured it out. In the late 1940s, he said mathematically it can be shown, and I won't quote it word for word, but he was basically saying, well, if the economy grows at a certain rate and then prices go up at a certain rate, that the government can borrow on average X percent of the national income indefinitely without the tax burden ever rising above 8% of national income. He was basically making the mathematical argument for perpetual deficits. They never end, and the government never gets in trouble. I've done it on spreadsheets. It's absolutely true. Okay. And if we grow 2.5% a year, we have 2.5% inflation a year, that means real GDP goes up 5%. Generally speaking, the deficit can be 5% of GDP every year, and you can go on into infinity with this, and the debt as a percent of GDP will never change. Okay. You have a question?
You mean nominal GDP?
Yes.
You said real, you mean nominal.
Did I say real?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Okay, no, I didn't mean it. So do you want me to let me rephrase that? let me rephrase that again. So if the real GDP, okay, if the real economy grows at 2.5%, and we also add 2.5% inflation, that's 5% nominal growth in GDP. Okay, I'm being very careful now. Okay, therefore, the federal government can borrow, can run a deficit equal to 5% of GDP year after year after year, as long as the growth and the inflation continue. And if you look at it mathematically, the debt as a percent of GDP is constant; it never changes. Okay. And a critic, Joseph Stagg-Lawrence, was a fellow Austrian traveler. He wrote, "The complete capitulation of a large segment of high-level thinking to a Keynesian thesis is illustrated by Professor Alvin Hansen." I mean, this really did start. I don't know if Keynes himself said we should do this, but once this theory got rolling, policymakers and government said, "Hey, what a great idea! Let's just adopt perpetual inflation, and then this will allow us to borrow without end, up to a limit." Okay. I have a theory that this easy out has been adopted by what were previously hawkish-sounding politicians. Okay. A lot of conservatives in particular run for office saying the debt is immoral, it's reprehensible. It is. Okay, I agree. I think it is. And I'm going to be a deficit hawk, and including Trump, who I'm not just for the record, I'm not an anti-Trump person, but Trump, he ran heavily on Obama racking up the debt, and we need to get it under control. And now what's the deficit going to be this year? $800 billion, $900 billion dollars. And I have a theory that every president, most people who've been elected president are not economists. I think they get into office, and I think it doesn't take long for their Treasury secretaries to get a hold of them and explain to them, you don't have to be this hawkish. And then the moment there's the least bit of political pressure, there's a standoff with Congress, there's a budget battle, the government shuts down, everyone's pointing finger, I call it the easy out, right? Why deal with the political unpleasantness of having to raise taxes, or what most of us in the room would probably prefer to cut the spending, when you can actually borrow more than you think you can with little to no consequence? Okay, yeah, we are getting near the end here. Now this is where it gets more uncertain. So a few problems that can knock the plan off course, that's a bit of an understatement. So if you keep growing at 2.5% inflation, you keep borrowing 5% of GDP year after year after year, yeah, you can get away with it. Mathematically, you can just keep doing this forever. But in the real world, things aren't that smooth, right? We don't consistently grow at 2.5% a year with 2.5% inflation per year and run 5% deficits. So what are some things that can kind of disrupt this master plan? Well, number one is you get a big bump in the road. The 2008 recession was a very big figurative bump in the road. It was a triple whammy for people who want to borrow forever. Number one, revenues fell. Okay, in order for this perpetual borrowing model to work, the economy's got to grow 2.5%, and the assumption is you're collecting 2.5% more in taxes, actually 5% more in taxes if you include the inflation. But we had this huge recession, and tax revenues went way down. Number two, the government spent even more. Okay, Bush, this last year, there was some bailout money and a little bit of stimulus, but Obama, if you're a conservative about your economics, you're going to say, unfortunately, Obama, we got a president who is very Keynesian in his thinking, whose advisors told him the way to get out of the recession is to spend more money, right? Borrow $1.4 trillion deficits every year and just spend it on roads to nowhere, stimulus, you name it, whatever. Some of the projects I could tell you, I'm sure we've heard that the stimulus was spent on. So revenues went way down, which the government had less control over, but spending went way up, which the government did have control over. So now the debt is ballooning. And not only that, you probably heard the inflation pause, right? The Fed had a lot of trouble getting inflation at 2.5% in the years following the crisis. We heard a lot of talk about deflation or disinflation or zero inflation or insufficient inflation, because in the middle of a crisis, when banks start to constrain their lending, the growth in the money supply begins to slow. So all three of these worked against this perpetual deficit model. And if I can back up, it's not a coincidence that this happened, okay? Okay, this is the debt as a percent of GDP. Most people say, well, that's all Obama. That's all Obama. He spent all that money. Well, it's true. Obama had a lot to do with that, but it also has to do with shortfall in tax revenues and the Federal Reserve for several years could consistently create the kind of inflation rates that it wanted to. Okay, what else could go wrong? Well, we could add all kinds of new huge spending programs. And my timing was pretty good on this. We've been hearing a lot lately about Medicare for All and the Green New Deal, right? These programs are going to cost trillions and trillions of additional dollars. So if we're already having trouble now keeping the deficits within the limits to maintain this perpetual deficit model, what's going to happen when we adopt a new program that's going to cost $1 trillion more per year, and then another new program on top of that's going to cost another $1 trillion per year? So at a minimum, if in order for this to work, you've got to keep holding the line. If by some crazy chance the Sanders Ocasio-Cortez ticket won the presidency, and all of the far left progressive wing of the Democratic Party got complete control of Congress, and they actually started to implement these sorts of programs. And let's just argue for the moment that they didn't get sufficient taxes, although I think the taxes required to pay for all this would throw us into a pretty big recession in and of itself. Then this perpetual deficit model is going to break down. The national debt is going to become a really big problem much faster, and you're probably going to see higher and higher inflation in order to deal with it. I put an asterisk here because I think this could be the most immediate concern is rising interest rates. The government's been able to borrow really, really cheap for the last 8 to 10 years, so it's amazing with $22 trillion in debt just how little the interest payments are. But that's changing now, right? Interest rates are going up. The good news is the $22 trillion that we already owe, those interest rates for the most part have already been locked in at a low number, other than TIPS, the Treasury inflation something security. So a small amount of debt that the government issues actually adjusts for inflation. Okay, but it's tiny. But any new money we borrow, we're having to borrow at higher and higher interest rates because rates are going up. So this can create a problem because as your interest payments go larger and larger, that's all baked into the budget, and the deficits could become larger and larger as well as a percent of GDP. And then finally, and this is the one that worries me the most long term, is demographics. So I refer to something here called the dependency ratio. The dependency ratio is the ratio of people who don't work to the ratio of people who do, roughly. Okay, so every country wants the highest ratio of workers to non-workers, and dependents include children, but more importantly, seniors. Okay, so we had a great dependency ratio in the 80s and 90s because the baby boomers were all entering the workforce, and now the baby boomers have just started retiring. I'm sure you read about this in the papers. So the dependency ratio is starting to move against the U.S., and the commitments for Social Security, what we call unfunded liabilities, right, our Social Security and Medicare payments, are going to go up. Now, I mentioned that demographics are a cycle. The elderly who are retiring, eventually they're going to die. And it sounds terrible, but it's true. They will die, and then the dependency ratio, so long as we're having enough new children, and this sounds really horrible how calculating it is, but I guarantee you, government policymakers, they all think this way. Okay, as long as you're having enough children, the dependency ratio curve will move back up in your favor. Okay, so unfunded liabilities aren't a forever problem. They're a problem you're going to have to deal with for 15, 20, 25 years, and then as the elderly start to, I'll say you have fewer elderly, I'll be nice about it, then it's less of a problem anymore. But if your birth rates are insufficient, that really worries governments, and this is a bit of a side topic, so I'm not going to talk long about it, but it's something for you to think about. That's what immigration is about. Okay, if you're wondering why the Europeans in particular are bringing in so many immigrants from Eastern Europe and from the Middle East, it's because their policymakers are saying we're not going to have enough workers to pay for all the promises we made to our aging populations. We all know European countries aren't having a lot of children, so they're bringing in immigrants. And the United States actually would have a negative or a insufficient birth rate if it weren't for legal. I think with legal immigration it's still sufficient. With illegal immigration it becomes, I guess, less of a problem if you assume the illegal immigrants ultimately are going to be productive enough. Okay, what about unfunded liabilities? I'm moving to the bigger and bigger, more uncertain problems. Have you guys ever heard this? Over the next 75 years, our unfunded liabilities are $87 trillion or $100 trillion to GDPs. Okay, that sounds really scary. It is worrisome, but it's not as bad as it sounds. That's over 75 years. 75 years from now, if the economy grows at 2.5% every year, and we have 2.5% inflation every year, I did the math, That's 4,060% growth. So in nominal terms, GDP will be $852 trillion. Now, most of us won't be around to witness that, but in probably a little under a century, we could have a $1 quadrillion nominal GDP. Assuming this $87 trillion in commitments is nominal, and I don't think it entirely is, the $87 trillion doesn't sound that scary, right? If you're taxing 22% of GDP 75 years from now, the federal government's revenues are going to be $187 trillion per year. Okay, it sounds absurd, but I guarantee if you go back and look at budget tables from 75 years ago and look at the numbers, they're going to seem like a pittance. If someone had told people 75 years ago that we would have a federal budget of $4 trillion, our GDP would be $21 trillion, they would think you're talking science fiction unless they understood the mathematics of compounded growth and inflation. Okay.
So Chris, I looked it up, the end of World War II, $250 billion.
Thank you. $250 billion, right? So how many days does it take the federal government to collect that much revenue today, right? If you assume $4 trillion in revenues, if my math is, that's a little over a month worth of tax revenues for the federal government. Okay. And I think I anticipated my next point already, which was if you went back to 1937, U.S. GDP in nominal terms was only $93 billion. Okay, so the same unfunded liabilities, the same ratio, we would have told people, hey, you're going to pay $385 billion over the next 75 years in unfunded liabilities, and people would have freaked out. They'd say, hey, our entire economy is only $93 billion. Well, here we are 75 years later, right? If you were to inflation adjust that, it would still be only $1.17 trillion, and our economy today is $20 trillion. Now, how about if you have to adjust for inflation? Okay, that becomes a problem because we've made certain promises that are going to go up with inflation, right? Social Security, you're supposed to get inflation-adjusted payments. The cost of medicine for the elderly is going up faster than inflation. So here's where I start getting into some of the additional games that the government can use. And again, I feel really kind of dirty talking about these, but so forget even inflation for the moment. How about fiscal games? We've all heard this, right? For Social Security, we know what they're going to do. They're going to raise the retirement age, right? That'll be one way that they'll reduce the quantity of liabilities they have to pay. I think I heard Sean Hannity once say that the retirement age will become 30 minutes before you die. Okay, all right. They'll increase the payroll tax yet again. I don't know if you remember early in Obama's term, he floated that as a trial balloon. He actually talked about raising the payroll tax. The payroll tax originally, when it was introduced in the Great Depression, was 1% of your paycheck, and your employer put in 1%.
Wow.
To be fair, it was already planned that it would go up to 2%. Like 15 years later, but then it would end there for good. Y'all know what it is now?
No.
It's 6.2% of your check plus 6.2% from your employer. So they've raised it.
And then there's Medicare.
It is Medicare as well, right? So they've raised it continuously over the decades. They'll raise it again.
Yeah.
Okay, it'll go up to 7.5% or whatever.
They'll have to pay for EDI.
This one, I think this one's coming first. Okay, means testing. Because it's politically the easiest one to get away with. You guys heard this term before? Yeah. Means testing means, well, we're having problems making our Social Security payments, so you know what? If you have net assets of greater than $1 million, you're just not going to get any Social Security when you get old. I think that one will come first because it's always easy to kind of cordon off the richest Americans and say, well, you don't deserve it, you're evil, you're part of the 1% or the 2% or whatever. And then finally, they'll probably pad official inflation numbers. That's in the next slide. Okay, so I only have, I think, 2 slides left and we'll be done. It's like I am going to go close to 2 hours, sorry. All right, so now I've got all this bad news about all these things that can happen. Well, it turns out if a lot of bad things happen and the debt gets bigger than we think, it goes to 130% or 150% or 170% of GDP. Well, unfortunately, the government still has some tools in its workshop. Okay, the first isn't even a tool. The first is, sadly, the government, I think, can get away with a lot more borrowing than we think. You guys know Japan's debt to GDP ratio right now is 260%. Okay, ours is 106. They're at 260. Now, I'm not saying we should do this, okay, but I am saying we have a precedent. Japan is not nearly as large and liquid a market for debt as we are, Japanese bond. Japan doesn't enjoy the prestige of the world reserve currency. It's not viewed as the preeminent economy in the world. And they've managed to get away with this, all right, without having to resort to runaway inflation in order to reduce the debt. So, and I know there are policymakers in our government who are aware of this. So in their minds, even though they don't want to go to 260, I know they're thinking, hey, we got a lot more room to go. I know the Keynesians, like Paul Krugman, they've written about this. They're saying, why are you freaking out about 106% debt to GDP ratio? We can go way higher, no problem. Look at Japan. So that's one thing we can get away with. We can go higher. Okay, is the U.S. Yeah, the U.S. is the blue and Japan's the yellow. All right. Well, what if we really, really get into trouble? We get all the way up to these numbers. Okay. Well, you don't need hyperinflation. You can just resort to 1970s style inflation. Any of you old enough to remember the Jimmy Carter years?
Too well.
Okay. Yeah, too well, right? You had some years where you had 6% inflation, 10% inflation. I got the average. From 71 to 83, the average inflation rate was 8.4% a year. We had 15% inflation in the worst year. Don't get me wrong, it was a horrible time to be alive, okay? But it wasn't hyperinflation, it wasn't the Great Depression, it wasn't Mad Max the Road Warrior. And along the way, the government had, by very, very conveniently, the government managed to reduce the value of the dollar to 38 cents. You know how huge an impact that had on the real value of the national debt. It cut it down by over half in 12 years. So I don't want them to do this, but I'm saying even moderately higher inflation is a tool enough for a government to get out of a bind when it comes to a national debt. You don't need Zimbabwe level hyperinflation. In the year 2049, so here's where I got to gather my thoughts here. I'm saying my original remark was at 2.5% growth and 2.5% inflation. That our GDP would be $92 trillion. So let's say we really get in trouble and our debt is up to $221 trillion, which is 240% of GDP. This is a worst case scenario. Okay, so this is a Japan level debt. Okay, well, let's say we go modest. Let's say we keep growing at 2.5% a year, but we adopt 12 years of Jimmy Carter era. I should not just pick on him. It was Nixon and Ford also. Well, now your GDP, instead of being $92 trillion, grows to $326 trillion. So your debt to GDP ratio is... So all it takes is one Jimmy Carter stagflation era to get your debt down from 240% to 68% of GDP. Okay. What about, you still have inflation adjusted unfunded liabilities. You got to make Social Security and Medicare payments. And when prices go up, those payments are going to go up too. Well, you know what? I think the government would do this. You generate 8.4% inflation for 12 years, but your official number is 7%. I mean, we already suspect the official numbers are being lowballed, right? Okay. And I put in Argentina. You guys know, right? Argentina had 25% inflation recently during the Kirchner years, but the official inflation number was 10% because they had inflation-adjusted bonds to foreigners, so they were getting away paying less in real terms. And then when some economists in Argentina came out and said, we think that's wrong. We think the rate is really 25%. They got slapped with $100,000 fines by the national government. Okay. So I'm not saying they would slap you with fines here, but I'm saying all it takes is a small lie. Okay, 8.4. You say, okay, we're only going to report 7% instead. Okay, and then if you generate for the remaining 18 years, you generate just 4% inflation, and you officially report 3%. You wind up with, by sleight of hand, $100 trillion additional dollars in tax revenues greater than what you promised to pay out. Okay, it's $533 trillion in tax revenues, but your liabilities are that you would have paid $533 trillion on are actually only going to be $383 trillion, all because for 12 years you lowballed your official inflation rate by 1.4%, and then you lowballed it by 1% for the remaining 18 years. It sounds criminal, doesn't it? But yeah. Okay, this is my last slide and we'll be done. So my final disclaimer for all this criminal conspiracy I'm talking about to use growth and a lot of inflation in order to get out of paying a large national debt. This is playing with fire, okay? And that's how I think of it. If a policymaker says we can get away with it, we can create we can accumulate a debt equal to 240% worth of GDP. We can run inflation rates of 8.4% and report 7% for 12 years. We can then run inflation rates of 4% and report 3% per year. They might get away with it, but you're pushing the edge of the envelope so hard. I equate this to playing with fire. And obviously, none of us in this room are going to recommend that the government adopt these sorts of policies. The car here, this is my own home-baked analogy. You guys done the PCH before with all the windy roads on the cliffside, right? So you've got this hot rod car, and you're driving in those curves at 80 miles an hour. Okay, one false move, and you can go crashing to your death. And someone says you shouldn't do that. And you say, oh, I saw a Japanese sports car. I'm using Japan for a reason, okay? That Japanese sports car in front of me did it at 120 miles per hour, and he's okay, all right? Well, he probably did, but does that really mean we should try to up our sports car to 100 miles per hour? Absolutely not, okay? So now you know what the tools, the available tools to the government for dealing with the national debt. But the exclamation mark at the end of my presentation is we should not let it get to that, and we should not try to use those tools because we're playing with fire, okay? All right, so that's the end of the presentation. All right, thanks. Should we, we got to order by 10. It's 9:30. Should we maybe do 10 minutes, 15 minutes of Q&A if there are any questions?
Yeah, I'm gonna.
You're going to call
I
them?
can help you pack up while we're doing it.
Okay, all right.
I mean, does it take you long to pack up?
No.
No.
Yeah, it'll take me 5 minutes to pack up. Okay.
10 minutes of questions.
So let's do 10 minutes of Q&A. All right, so a question?
Yeah, so I get the GDP part of it. I'm just curious how this works out with the basket of goods. So, what do you have those numbers on? Are $1970 or is the average person in our population doing better or worse with that basket of goods? I mean, we've had massive growth, but I'm just trying to ground it out in that area of life where is the population doing better or worse in terms of?
Yeah, I don't know. I know what the basket of goods is. You're referring,
Yeah.
right, to trying to measure inflation based on how much this basket with common items in it
Or basically
Cost-
lifestyle.
costs today. Yeah, I don't know. I've never looked it up. I think in terms of our standards of living and
That's okay.
on a if you say per capita GDP, and I don't just mean a number, all right, I mean the quantity and quality of goods and services available to each person on a per capita basis, we're definitely better off, right? But in terms of adjusting for inflation using the basket of goods,
That's what I was trying
I
for.
can't.
Because,
I don't know.
I don't feel my kids can buy a house for the same amount.
Well, okay, so hang on.
Right.
So first, the house doesn't fit in the basket, all right? But second, housing is a completely unique case. It's an exception.
Or fruits and vegetables.
Yeah, that would be a better one because
Yeah, we can use
somebody-
that because they're much more expensive.
we live in San Francisco. We already know what's up with housing, okay?
Yeah.
The supply of housing is being artificially constrained by local government policies in most coastal cities.
Well, we can use
And-
college education. We can use
College education-
fruits and vegetables. We can use milk. You can choose
I-
any other.
I'm
commodity.
sorry to keep picking on you, but
Yeah.
there's three big ones that are way above inflation: college, education, healthcare, and housing. Okay,
Yeah.
all three of these. I don't have time to go into it. All three of these, the inflation rates are all a direct result of government intervention in those industries. Okay, if they were truly like, I won't say laissez-faire, but as free market as televisions or software or even fruits and vegetables. I know fruits and vegetables get some government subsidies. Okay. But if the government were as hands-off in those three sectors as it is in the average sector in the economy, we would not be seeing the kinds of unaffordability in those three areas. Maybe I should do a talk on that, right,
Yeah.
instead. Yeah, okay. Great idea. Okay, but I can't answer your basket of goods
Okay.
question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Try it.
All right, yeah, you're welcome. All right, any other questions? No one wants to know if they should buy gold? I'm just kidding.
Bernanke, like you were saying, okay, one of being right, but he was correct in answering the onslaught of questions he got during the Ron Paul areas of questioning on raising the government debt at the time. Do you think the around that same time, I don't know if this has anything to do with it, the FDIC raising the amount that,
Yeah, that was federally insured, that raising the balance.
the balance?
Yeah, the limit to what they would federally insure on a deposit account.
Yeah,
Is there a connection between that and what, the rising national debt?
Yeah.
Is that your question?
yeah.
Yeah, I don't think so. No, I think the FDIC raising, that was a measure in the middle of the crisis to try to persuade people not to pull their money out of the banks.
So that was just like we better do this and just in case.
Yeah, yeah. And for what it's worth, have any of you ever read Milton Friedman's Monetary History? This is the book he got the Nobel Prize for. He makes the case, he's pretty libertarian, okay, but when something in the government successfully served a purpose, he'll say it. I agree with him. Of all of the reforms in the last 100 years in banking and money to stem or prevent financial crises or from getting worse, deposit insurance has probably been the most successful. Okay, and it's not the Fed, it's not lender of last resort, it's not QE, all that, it's deposit insurance. Right after deposit insurance was introduced during the Great Depression, if you look at the amount of money that people were depositing in banks, it just went straight up. And I think it was a similar measure. They saw the crisis was there. They knew people, I don't remember the number, it might have been 100,000 or something. They knew no one
It was
would.
100,000.
It was originally 100,000 and
Yeah,
it went up
250.
250, that's what I thought. Okay, so they knew people who had balances of under 100,000 were very unlikely to pull the money out, but they were concerned that between 100 and 250,
Which is the majority of the, how should we say, labor tax-paying citizens.
yeah,
as
right.
opposed
And then
to-
if you go over 250, it's true you've got some mega millionaires with large balances, but probably as a percent, they probably calculated as a percent of all nationwide deposits, it was probably negligible enough that they didn't have to go much higher. So no, I think it had nothing to do with the debt. I think it was purely to make sure there wasn't a series of bank runs.
Right, and it's not like the FDIC or any insurance company for that matter would actually do that.
Would do what?
Well, when insurance companies, especially we've seen during the crises, some of them actually, I mean, I'm not saying that the FDIC would do that, but just the fact, like you said, that being there, and, oh yeah, we would get, if it's federally insured, we would get our money back if something happened like that.
Yeah.
But just having it there gave people enough.
Oh yeah. All right. I think I know what you're saying. Yeah. The FDIC didn't have the money, but they had. I think they had by the lowest point in the crisis. The FDIC had about less than 1/2 of 1 cent for every dollar that they were officially insuring. But it's psychological
Yeah.
impact.
Political.
And the FDIC announced that if they ran out, they already announced if they ran out of money, they were going to go to Congress was standing by to give them, loan them. I don't know how it would work, loan them more money. But yeah, deposit insurance psychologically, that's the most important thing. It works psychologically because you feel secure, you feel safe. The FDIC has never failed to pay out. Okay, it's always paid out. It's paid out 100% historically of all of its obligations. You feel safe. It's why I keep what little money I've got with the bank in a bank. You know.
Also, they are very good at arranging for stronger banks to take over the assets
Yeah.
of the failing banks.
Yes.
They hardly pay it out.
Yeah,
They pay it
absolutely.
out on
Which,
nothing.
those of you who were here last year, remember in Canada, whenever anything that looked like a crisis was occurring, since they had large nationally branched banks, which the U.S. did not have in the 19th century, the big banks would buy out the smaller banks. And today, the FDIC brokers those sorts of deals. So famously, you guys remember, I live in this neighborhood. Clement and Fourth used to be a WAMU, and now it's a Chase. Because WAMU failed, the FDIC brokered the Chase buyout of WAMU, and the two share in they call it the deposit loss sharing. That's not the exact term, but in terms of what loss you end up taking when you when you acquire the failed bank, the FDIC shares with the acquiring bank the burden of the loss. Yeah. Okay, we've got time for one or two more.
9:37, I don't want to.
Yeah, don't want to push it. Okay, how about one more? Or maybe there are no more questions. If there are no more questions, we'll stop.
They can brave it at the bar, but
Yep.
I think you can still hear yourself speak. I think that's.
Well, you know what? If it's a really good question, we'll step outside. How does that sound? So.